Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Roderick Galam, a senior lecturer in sociology at Oxford Brookes University. I am a sociologist of migration with a primary interest in maritime labor. That said, together with a colleague at the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands, I have recently concluded a study on undocumented Filipino migrant domestic workers in the UK and the Netherlands, focusing on their experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was part of an international collaborative project funded by the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. I have drawn on this study to develop this lecture. So, what is this lecture about? In this lecture, I will talk about Filipino MDWs or migrant domestic workers in the United Kingdom. Specifically, I will look at their situation in the context of the UK hostile environment policy. Filipinos in the UK. Filipinos represent the largest Southeast Asian community in the UK. In the 2011 census of almost 249,000 Southeast Asians, about 143,000 were Filipinos, accounting for 58% of the total. It is claimed that the Southeast Asian population has doubled in size since 2001, and the Philippine Embassy in London estimates that there are 200,000 Filipinos in the UK. There is a significant number of undocumented Filipino migrant workers in the UK. It is estimated that there are as many as 10,000 of them, with the vast majority concentrated in London and working as domestic workers, carers, and in other sectors of the informal economy. The strong presence of undocumented Filipino migrants in the UK working as domestic workers is historically linked to previous Filipino labor migration in the 1960s to Europe, where they were predominantly employed in the care and service sectors as domestic workers, nurses and other healthcare workers, au pairs, and hotel workers. The late 1970s marked the beginning of sustained Filipino labor migration to the UK. Filipinos moving to the UK then were employed in households as domestic workers, in the service and hospitality sectors as waiters, waitresses, and chambermaids, and in hospitals as auxiliary nurses. Beginning in 2000, the recruitment of Filipino nurses by the National Health Service to address its staffing problems led to the sustained growth of Filipino migration to the UK. So, who are domestic workers? According to the International Labour Organization, domestic workers are those workers who perform work in or for a private household or households. They provide direct and indirect care services and, as such, are key members of the care economy. Their work may include tasks such as cleaning the house, cooking, washing and ironing clothes, taking care of children or elderly or sick members of a family, gardening, guarding the house, driving for the family, and even taking care of household pets. A domestic worker may work on full-time or part-time basis, may be employed by a single household or through or by a service provider, and may be residing in the household of the employer or may be living in his or her own residence. A domestic worker may be working in a country of which she or he is not a national, thus referred to as a migrant domestic worker. 2021 figures from the ILO show that there were about 75.6 million domestic workers worldwide, 76.2% of whom were women. This means that one quarter of domestic workers were men. In 2015, there were 11.5 million migrant domestic workers, 17.2% of the total number of domestic workers. Domestic workers contribute substantially to the global economy, making up 7.5% of women's global total wage employment. Let's look at the vulnerability of domestic work. Various reports have highlighted the exploitation and abuse of migrant domestic workers. They are a vulnerable group because domestic work is inherently undervalued and underpaid, and workers perform their job in the privacy of their employer's home. They are vulnerable also because they are excluded from the protection of labor legislation. This gives rise to what has been called as legislative precariousness, the special vulnerability created by the explicit exclusion of a lower degree of protection of certain categories of workers from protective laws. Immigration legislation adds further precariousness by treating migrant domestic workers as different from other migrant workers. This combination of labor and immigration regimes exacerbates the vulnerability and exploitability of migrant domestic workers, from individual abuse by employers to institutional exploitation. So, what are the forms of exploitation experienced by migrant domestic workers in the UK? The report exploring the nature of labor exploitation among domestic workers in the UK by Salim Yilmaz and Caroline Emberson, which was published in 2023, included composite indicators of 6 types of labor exploitation, including severe forms of labor abuse that may indicate criminal exploitation in the form of modern slavery, servitude, and forced labor. Yilmaz and Emberson found widespread levels of verbal abuse and a lack of privacy, reported payments at below national living wage levels, a lack of freedom over the choice of working hours, and reports of more severe forms of exploitation, including physical or sexual violence, withholding wages or identity documents, and the potential for debt bondage. The findings of abuse and exploitation echo similar findings of earlier studies. How about Filipino domestic workers in the UK? In 2019, the Home Office issued almost 23,000 visas for overseas domestic workers, accompanying their employers. Almost 50% of these visas were for domestic workers from the Philippines. In 2020, the Home Office issued 14,727 overseas domestic workers visa. In 2021, only 8,944 such visas were issued. The fall in number was due to the global COVID-19 pandemic. In 2022, 18,553 ODW visas were issued. Of these, 10,186 visas were issued to workers from the Philippines, and 3,858 were issued to Indian workers. This means that 54.9% of all ODW visas were issued to Filipinos. The Philippines is clearly the single biggest source of domestic workers in the UK. Other significant sources of domestic workers coming to the UK are Bangladesh, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, Egypt, and Ethiopia. As you can see from the figures, migrant domestic workers are heavily drawn from the global south. Let's look at UK policies for migrant domestic workers. Let's first look at what was there before 1998. So before 1998, migrant domestic workers had no formal route to enter the UK. They were given leave to enter either as a visitor, a family member, or given a stamp to work with someone. They were therefore not formally recognized as workers, consequently making them extremely vulnerable to exploitation by their employers and others. They were tied to their employer. In other words, they could not change employer without losing their immigration status. They had no path to settlement, so that those who escaped abusive employers became undocumented. A long campaign waged by migrant domestic workers, civil society organizations, and the Transport and General Workers Union, now Unite the Union, led to the Labor government introducing changes in 1998. From 1998 to April 2012, the ODW visa allowed migrant domestic workers to change employers and find a new job within the same sector of domestic work without losing their immigration status. Indeed, they could apply to extend their work visa, which is valid for 1 year, with their new employer. After 5 continuous years of lawful employment, they could apply for settlement. However, changes to UK immigration rules in 2012 introduced a tied visa system in which migrant domestic workers are allowed to be in the UK for only 6 months without a possibility for renewal. And should they leave their employer during this period, they could lose their immigration status and therefore risk being deported. This 2012 tied visa system created what Montovalu has called an extremely vulnerable workforce that stays in the UK undocumented and fearful, trapped in ongoing cycles of exploitation. A much higher number of migrant domestic workers with tied visas compared to those with not tied visas suffered physical abuse, not being allowed to leave the house freely, not having time off, not being paid at all, and having their passports taken away from them. The UK adopted the Modern Slavery Act in 2015. Academics and civil society organizations pointed out that the ODW visa was at odds with the UK government's efforts to tackle modern slavery, as it made migrant domestic workers susceptible to human trafficking and slavery-like situations. The government responded that those who experienced abuse could go through the National Referral Mechanism, or NRM, which is the UK's framework for modern slavery victims. However, in the face of criticism and campaigning, the government committed to an independent review of the terms of the visa and whether it facilitated abuse. The independent review recommended that ODWs be given the universal right to change employer and apply for annual extensions of their visa up to a total period of 2.5 years. The government did not accept that domestic workers should have the right to renew their visa, but accepted that they needed an escape route from abuse. In April 2016, it reinstated the right to change employer, but only within the 6 month validity of the domestic worker's visa and with no extensions allowed. Finding a new employer with only a short time left on their visa is extremely difficult, forcing many to go undocumented. The restrictive immigration regime of the 2012 ODW visa thus compounds the legislative precariousness of migrant domestic workers. Table 1 summarizes the changes in the terms and provisions of the ODW visa over the years. And I've borrowed this table from Joyce Jiang. Let's have a look at the UK hostile environment and its specific consequences for migrants. So we must situate the changes to the ODW visa in the context of the UK hostile environment policy. In the last 3 decades or so, UK immigration policies shifted from integration to hostility with a focus on deterrence. Migration management thus took a punitive approach, enforced through detention, destitution, dispersal, and deportation. The UK's hostile environment for migrants, formalized by the Immigration Act 2014 and strengthened by the Immigration Act 2016, consisted of a set of policies designed to make life intolerable for undocumented migrants by denying them access to public services and the necessities of life, namely housing, healthcare, legal employment, bank accounts, and driving licenses, as well as measures preventing sham marriages. They were designed to force undocumented migrants to voluntarily leave the country. To be sure, this voluntary departure or self-deportation is not voluntary. Undocumented migrants are simply not given any other option at all. The hostile environment has been characterized as a state-led marginalization of immigrants and as a policy of forced destitution, with profound consequences not just on undocumented migrants but on British society as well. Migrants with undocumented status face destitution and homelessness as a result of forced unemployment. They are forced to live in crowded accommodation and to work in the informal economy, the only sector where they can get work but where they are exploited and underpaid because of their status. Living under constant pressure, threat, and fear, they are made poorer, sicker, and unhappier. And that's according to Griffiths and Morgan Glendinning. As a deliberate state mechanism to exclude and remove undocumented migrants from the UK, the hostile environment creates and expands internal borders and border controls in everyday life, whose policing enlists not only non-state actors such as agencies, institutions, or organizations, but also private individuals. Griffiths and Yeo use deputization to conceptualize the devolution of responsibility to police the UK borders and their diffusion throughout everyday spaces. Deputization refers to the co-opting of organizations and people as de facto immigration officers, through which a medley of actors are made street-level bureaucrats responsible for enacting and interpreting immigration policy on the ground. Conscripted into border policing are employers, civil servants dealing with benefits, local authority housing and benefits officers and social workers, private landlords, colleges and universities that have international staff and students, NHS hospital staff, bank and building society managers, the driver and vehicle licensing agency, and marriage registrars. Employers and landlords face stiff fines and imprisonment if they hire or rent to individuals without authorization to be in the UK, while colleges and universities face fines as employers and the withdrawal of their sponsorship license for failure to impose strict controls on international students. The deputization of border policing to private individuals demands of UK residents to inflict considerable harm on each other with profoundly significant consequences for individuals and broader society. The hostile environment encourages and legitimizes racism and xenophobia. The hostile environment has failed in reducing the number of undocumented migrants, but has undoubtedly produced their illegality and increased their precarity. The hostile environment is thus an act of bordering, which constitutes a principal organizing mechanism in constructing, maintaining, and controlling social and political order. This mechanism includes determining not only who is and who is not entitled to enter the country, but also whether those who do would be allowed to stay, work, and acquire civil, political, and social rights. It sustains British colonial hierarchies that are racist and racialized. The state sanctioned violence committed against migrants through the web of hostile environment policies are pushing undocumented migrants into more dangerous and harmful situations, making them more exposed and vulnerable to exploitation. The most affected by these measures are racialized and impoverished migrants, especially those working as domestic workers. So, how did Filipino UMTWs, undocumented migrant domestic workers, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, suffer as a result of these hostile environment policies? So during the COVID-19 lockdowns, Filipino UMTWs lived in cramped accommodations, making them unable to isolate themselves when they contracted COVID-19 and refused to see a doctor for fear of being reported to the home office. Unable to work and with no access to social welfare assistance, they were left in dire financial situations, if not destitution. In her report on how the current pandemic has affected precarious Filipino migrants, Ella Parry Davis emphasizes that the policies that have had the most impact on them are the criminalization of illegal working with increased financial penalties and prison sentences for employers, the requirement for landlords and letting agents to check tenants' immigration status before renting to them, and powers to evict tenants without the right to rent, charges for NHS care for certain migrants at 150% of the cost to the NHS, and patient data sharing between the NHS and the Home Office for the purposes of immigration enforcement. So, given what is happening, what are Filipino migrant domestic workers and domestic workers from other countries doing? They are therefore engaged in collective protest, collective organization, campaigning for policy changes, direct lobbying, and other forms of activism designed to change the prevailing legislative and immigration regimes that are the very sources of the suffering and illegality of UMTWs. They are campaigning specifically for a return to the 1998 visa, which gave MTWs the right to change employers and a path to settlement. They are also campaigning for the UK to ratify the ILO Convention on Decent Work for Domestic Workers, or Convention 189, which would give them recognition as workers. These forms of citizen activism and participation in political activities took UMTWs to the UK Parliament, the London City Hall, Home Office, streets, and online spaces. So here is an example of a migrant domestic worker involvement in this the kind of activism that I um, described. So Maria, 46 years old, an active member of the VODW, or Voice of Domestic Workers, which is a migrant organization composed of migrant domestic workers from all over the world who are working in the UK. Maria's human trafficking case with the NRM has been given conclusive grounds, um, and so um, she was eligible for a 2-year extension of her visa. She described her involvement in this um, activism in the following. So I'm just going to read what she said in my interview with her. So the first time I spoke at the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association was at the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. We gave testimonies. There were 3 of us from VODW before members of Parliament all of them. Although I've been going to the parliament when there are events, the first time I spoke before MPs was at the CPA. I've also spoken at the Home Office before the Modern Slavery Unit to do with the NRM. I was worried initially if I would be able to get out of the Home Office. I did not even know that what I did was direct lobbying. I told them my experiences under the system. Testimony is powerful. I said, your system is not for us. I am a human trafficking victim, but you are making things more difficult. You are making us suffer even more. I cannot work. It's true you give us financial assistance, but it is not enough. I told even the MPs this. One MP tweeted what I said and it went viral. Step in my shoes so you have an idea of what we are going through. So Filipino MDWs work with various other actors such as fellow migrants, co-nationals and not, churches and faith-based groups, migrant-focused NGOs, international humanitarian organizations such as Red Cross, Doctors of the World, local politicians, MPs, etc. So just to um, conclude this lecture, I would like to, end with the following summary of what I have just talked about. So Filipinos comprise the single biggest nationality group among MDWs, accounting for more than 50% of all migrant domestic workers in the UK. The exclusion of MDWs from both labor and immigration protection regulations exacerbates the vulnerability and exploitability of migrant domestic workers from individual abuse by employers to institutional exploitation. Changes to the ODW visa introduced in 2012 and 2016 have made the situation of MDWs more precarious, rendering them vulnerable to abuse and exploitation, and increasing the likelihood of becoming undocumented. Filipino MTWs, even those undocumented and in the legal process, are actively fighting for the return to the 1998 visa and for the ratification by the UK of the ILO Convention on Decent Work for Domestic Workers, which would give them recognition as workers. These are my references. Thank you very much for your attention.